Welcome to Wild Side, your wild true crime podcast.
We're your hosts, who are sisters, storytellers, and truth seekers.
I'm Bailey, a therapist who is fascinated by all weird and dark human behaviors.
And I'm Chelsea, an educator here to unearth the facts behind the cases.
We cover true crime because some cases are just too dark to forget,
and others are too wild to ignore.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride.
Welcome back, Wild Siders. So happy to have you here.
Hey guys, we hope your new year is starting off on the right foot.
Yeah.
And we hope you're ready for another case.
I wanted to say before we get into it, you guys, I wanted to give a big shout out to Patty Podcast, in her awesome review on Apple. It was so cute. She said, "I love your podcast. I can't wait to hear the new style, and you guys are so awesome." So, Patty, we were not expecting it, but thank you so much for your kind words.
Yeah, we really do appreciate any sort of feedback, good or bad. We appreciate it.
Good or bad. Yeah. So this week, you guys, we are going to start off with talking a little bit about good vibes, bad vibes, and trusting your gut, right? And Chelsea, have you ever been in a situation, or any of you guys listening, have you ever been in a situation where on the surface, on paper, everything sounds kosher, sounds good, no problems, but there's just something you can't shake about that person?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like when I go to order anything at any coffee shop, and I always try to get something, either half sweet or with almond milk or oat milk. And then I get this whole earful of like how, milk alternatives are a conspiracy theory. And you're just like, dude, I just kind of want my drink. I mean, thanks, but whatevs.
Yeah. Mine's usually the kid that comes into my office, and then when I staff it with my supervisor, I'm like, I'm not saying that this kid has homicidal ideations and wants to shoot up the school, but that's exactly what I'm not saying.
Right.
Like, you just picture them wearing like a trench coat.
Yeah.
And they flap it when they get real mad.
I mean, yep. It's a fine line. It really is a fine line between just awkward, right?
Yeah.
And something more sinister.
Yeah.
And I would say on that note, enter Nasen Saadi, Exhibit A for why trusting your gut isn't just self-care, it is survival.
It's true. And this is going to be a wild, pretzel, twisty case. To start this off, I want you guys to just imagine sitting on a quiet beach at night, the glow of a small fire, keeping the darkness at bay, hanging out with your friend, and then when out of the shadows, horror strikes.
In today's episode, we unravel the chilling story of Nasen Saadi, a criminology student whose obsession with true crime became more than just an interest. It became a deadly fixation.
It was October of 2023 when Saadi first walked into Lisa Marie Reese's lecture hall. At just 19 years old, he just ditched his physical education major and swapped it for criminology. Kind of an eyebrow-raising pivot that screamed of a sudden obsession. Reese, who was a criminology lecturer moonlighting as a special constable with the Met Police, had seen her fair share of students. Some were keen, others just coasting, but Saadi was different. From the moment he sat down, his stare locked in like a laser beam. It was too intense and it was too deliberate. When the lecture on the UK's political system wrapped up, Saadi sat still, didn't budge. While the other students filtered out, he stayed put. Not exactly unusual. Plenty of students will hang back for a quick word with the professor to get some extra help. But Saadi's questions, well, they were just off. "Can you claim self-defense if you attacked first?" he asked, but his tone was far too flat and he was far too eager. Reese just blinked. Politics had been the topic, not criminal law. She gave a careful yet measured response. But Saadi wasn't done. He pressed, wanting details about DNA evidence, how long it stuck around, how it got processed. The questions weren't curious, they were clinical in nature, calculated. Less like a student eager to learn, more like someone gathering intel. Trying to break the tension, Reese just chuckled and half joked, "You're not planning a murder, are you?" But Saadi barely glanced up. "Nah, just some research for a newspaper," he said with a shrug. But Reese wasn't buying it. There was something about him that just did not sit right with her. The kind of wrong that lingers in your gut, like we were talking about earlier. She flagged the encounter to the university, listening to her gut. She trusted her instincts. Unfortunately, she had no clue then just how much that small moment would matter.
Over the next few weeks, Saadi's behavior began to sour. The offhand comments in class, they weren't just awkward, they were sharp, loaded, and aimed primarily at women. He'd snare about how women were, quote, weaker than men, and had no place in tough jobs like law enforcement. The disdain wasn't subtle. It oozed out, poisoning the air and casting long shadows over his female classmates. This wasn't ignorance or bravado. It was personal. I mean, almost hostile, even. Lisa Marie Reese had dealt with plenty of difficult students, but Saadi was different. His remarks weren't just sexist outbursts. They were part of a larger, unsettling pattern. Saadi wasn't here to learn criminology. He was testing the edges, poking at the cracks in the system, like he was hunting for weak spots almost. His interest in crime wasn't academic, but more obsessive in nature. He wasn't drawn to justice. He was fascinated by the structure of violence. By November 2023, things had escalated. During a Q&A session with Reese's partner, Pavandeep Singh Anaja, also a special constable, Saadi's questions went deeper. But these questions were a little bit too deep. He wanted to know how police forces shared intel, almost like he was mapping their blind spots. But what really stuck out was his fixation on women in policing, as if the very idea bothered him more than it should.
These guys, you know who it reminds me of? This is the same type of dude that calls himself an alpha and does classes on how to get simp dudes laid. Have you seen those guys? And they're like, sign up for my class and I'll show you how to be a ladies' man. And they always have fedoras and shitty facial hair and they call everybody m'lady.
I mean, yes, which is really sad that, facial hair and fedoras have such a bad rap, because my husband dressed up in a fedora for my 40th birthday party and it was really sweet and he looked so precious. But
he
alas,
went around telling everybody he was an alpha.
Right.
But it wasn't just casual small talk about crime scenes anymore. By January of 2024, Saadi had gone full Google is my accomplice mode. He wasn't just dabbling in questions, he was deep diving like he was prepping for some twisted version of a history fair project. Stabbings, infamous knife murders, and the truly heartwarming search, what is the deadliest knife? Because nothing says, hey, I'm just a curious student, like actively ranking murder weapons. It was clear Saadi wasn't planning for a kitchen cutlery upgrade. His searches set off alarms, naturally, because of phrases like knife laws in England, and that doesn't exactly scream innocence. And in case anyone thought that that was the end of it, it was not. By April, he'd gone full QVC and racked up 6 knives. 6. That's arguably not a hobby, that's an inventory. His parents eventually found 2 of the knives and an axe. They sighed and did what any responsible adult would do. They confiscated them and hit him with a, hey, you really shouldn't do that again. That was it. No follow-up, no grounding, just a little light scolding for hoarding medieval weaponry. Feeling ever so slightly misunderstood, shocker, because they usually do, guys like this, Saadi packed up and moved in with his aunt and grandpa, because nothing says red flag parade like fleeing to family with fewer questions and more unlocked cabinets. By then, his little murder fantasy wasn't just an idea, it was practically a PowerPoint presentation. By February of 2024, the Metropolitan Police did open an investigation into him for stalking. But for whatever reason, it stalled. Saadi naturally took this as his cue to up his ante. His next search history were beaches in South England at night. Bournemouth caught his eye, and suddenly he's Googling things like West Cliff Zigzag Path and Bournemouth and secluded beaches. I'm sure it was all part of his quest for inner peace. But by mid-May, Saadi let his aunt know he was off to Dorset for some, quote, independent travel. She smiled, waved, and said, have fun and enjoy, as if he was heading to a yoga retreat and not actively casing murder spots.
Okay, so this kid, which I think we have to use that term lightly, right? He's 19 years old, so that weird transitional phase between literally being a kid and kind of inching into adulthood. But he has all these knives, an axe, and he's Googling secluded beaches. And his parents hit him with just a, hey, not a great idea, bud. Don't love that for you.
Yeah. Chelsea and our dad, I asked him one time what would happen if he ever found out that we were smoking weed. And he threatened to call the cops, shave our head, rip up our clothes, and ship us to boot camp. So I think there's a little bit of a difference between arguably how his family members handled him having axes, machetes, and knives.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard one, but I think it's one of those things like you probably should be concerned if your kid is getting a little too obsessive with anything, right? What no one realized, though, was that Saadi's, quote, independent travel was less of a scenic getaway and more of a let's see how far I can take this tour. Months of mapping, years of violent fantasies, and a lifetime of unchecked rage, all packed neatly into his carry-on. Because why not make it a hobby at this point? His trip to Bournemouth wasn't about relaxation. It was basically the final boss level in his personal game of how to fly under the radar. This is where we get to marvel at the tragic consequences of just vibing in isolation with your anger and knives. Saadi wasn't just some quiet loner. He was out here building a portfolio of red flags. And yet, as he packed his growing collection of blades and hopped on a train like he was heading to a beach bonfire, the world gave him a polite wave and kept it moving. The police? Well, they looked into him a little, but I guess the deadliest knife Google searches didn't exactly scream urgent. And his professor, I mean, she did sound the alarm, but turns out connecting dots isn't exactly society's strong suit. So there Saadi went off to Bournemouth with a backpack full of literal weapons and metaphors for collective failure. As he strolled towards the beach under the cover of night, he wasn't just carrying knives. He was hauling the weight of every ignored warning sign. And let's be honest, the biggest shock isn't what he did. It's how many people had front row seats to the red flag parade and just kind of, shrugged.
Saadi slipped under the radar, and unfortunately, it all culminated on May 21st, 2024. And that's when Saadi boarded a train from Croydon, his mind already consumed by the sinister plans he had meticulously been crafting for weeks. He had formulated a plan and convinced himself he was going to kill someone, anyone, just to see what it would feel like to kill. He checked into the Travelodge Hotel in Bournemouth, and after dropping off his bag at the hotel, he went outside to make a mental map of Bournemouth Pier and its surrounding areas. For the next few days, he carried out reconnaissance, mapping out CCTV camera locations and plotting the perfect moment to execute this horrific fantasy. The switch to the Silver Row Hotel, the visit to the cinema to watch The Strangers Chapter 1, which is a horror film, a slasher film, came first before he decided to act on part of his dark obsessions. At this point, it was clear. Saadi wasn't just planning a spur-of-the-moment attack. This was a culmination of long-brewing fixation on violence, fueled by his obsession with killers and the power that they hold. Saadi wasn't just looking for a victim, he was hunting for the perfect one. He wasn't aiming to lash out in a blind rage, but rather he wanted to feel the control, the rush of power that comes with holding someone's life in his hands. Honestly, a contrast to, arguably, the weak bitch that he really was. By the time he stepped onto Durley Chine Beach on May 24th, Saadi wasn't just wandering the night. He was steeped in a dark, twisted fantasy, one that he had nurtured for months. In his mind, he wasn't just some lost soul, he was the aggressor, the one in control of life and death. He was a predator, and that night he wasn't just lurking in the shadows, he was waiting.
As he moved between hotels in the days leading up to the attack, Saadi blended into the background, a ghost in the crowd, never drawing attention to himself. On the night of the attack, Saadi finally put his plan into action. Just after 11 p.m., as 34-year-old Amie Gray, her friend 38-year-old Leanne Miles sat on the beach enjoying a quiet moment. The two had lit a small campfire to keep warm and were in a fairly secluded part of the beach. Saadi appeared from the shadows. At first, Leanne thought it might be a prank until she turned around and saw the knife. What felt like a punch to the stomach at first quickly morphed into a gut-wrenching, all-encompassing pain of being stabbed. Saadi's attack was swift, brutal, and relentless. This wasn't just random violence. This was a man enacting a long-held fantasy. A predator who had spent days watching, preparing, and selecting his victims with chilling precision. It was about asserting power, controlling life. Saadi attacked two women whose yells were caught by a nearby CCTV camera. Amie Gray had been targeted in the chest, arm, and also heart, being stabbed 10 times.
After stabbing Amie, Saadi turned around to locate Leanne. She was chased along the beach, and when he caught up with her, he began ruthlessly stabbing her. Leanne begged with him, "Please stop, I've got children." But he continued his vicious attack. He had stabbed Leanne 20 times before leaving her to die. As quickly as he had come, Saadi was gone. Leanne, still clinging to life, managed to call 999. CCTV footage would capture the call, hearing her crying in pain to the operator. "I've been stabbed loads of times. Oh my God, I am getting dizzy. Please hurry up. Please hurry up." Paramedics rushed to the scene and they took over the emergency care and CPR on Amie. But the sports coach and mother's injuries were too severe, and she was quickly pronounced dead on the scene. Leanne was rushed to the hospital where she was in critical condition, but miraculously survived. Leanne would later go on to say that Amie had actually saved her life by bearing the brunt of the attack. A mother, a fitness instructor, a coach, a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others, was ripped away in the most senseless, brutal way imaginable. And Saadi's actions shocked the community through Bournemouth, who were left to grapple with the brutal reality of the senseless crime.
After the murder of Amie Gray and the attempted murder of Leanne Miles, Saadi went back to his hotel with his murder kit that included gloves, nail clippers, balaclava, and went to sleep. By morning, Saadi had quietly left Bournemouth like nothing had happened. thinking of his attack as a job well done. Saadi spent the next few days looking up news articles to see if his crime made the main headlines. Despite his best efforts to erase evidence, including tossing the clothes he was wearing during the attack, investigators were already hot on his trail. Detectives scoured CCTV footage, uncovering his every move, piecing together the trail he thought he had covered. And like so many killers, his arrogance was his downfall. Saadi thought he could outsmart the system, but he couldn't. Investigators began connecting the dots quickly, and within days, they had identified Saadi, apprehending him at his aunt's house. Detectives identified Saadi, who was a 20-year-old, just seemingly ordinary guy from a well-regarded family, described as warm, close-knit, and often traveling together, attending Buddhist ceremonies. When investigators interviewed Saadi, he quickly told police that he was wrongly accused of mistaken identity. He admitted to being in Bournemouth when confronted with CCTV footage, but of course denied having any involvement in Amie's murder. Saadi claimed he had no memory of the incident, that he had blacked out. Even when arrested, Saadi refused to unlock his phone, knowing the wealth of incriminating data it contained. But his silence wasn't enough to save him, as the circumstantial evidence was piling up against him.
As the investigation deepened, the psychological profile of Saadi continued to unfold in unsettling detail. It became clear that he wasn't a typical criminology student, but was someone whose fascination with crime and violence bordered on obsession. But Saadi, not being the brightest bulb in the box, and luckily for investigators, had left a digital trail serving himself up on a silver platter. His internet searches included things like the deadliest knife and how to get away with murder. In the weeks leading up to the attack, he had repeatedly searched for the details of murders, including those of 16-year-old Brianna Gay in Cheshire, a 13-year-old Millie Dowler from Surrey, and the Miyazawa family, the Setagaya in Tokyo. And if it wasn't already weird enough, investigators found that his online pseudonyms included Ninja Killer and NS Kills. In my opinion, what a loser. The truly chilling part, however, of Saadi's psychological state was his refusal to acknowledge responsibility for his actions. When questioned, he was cold, calculating, and detached, as we would expect. Despite the overwhelming evidence, he continued to deny any involvement in the murder of Amie Gray and the attempted murder of Leanne Miles. He even attempted to deflect, stating that beaches are popular places, as if trying to downplay the significance of his presence on the beach that night.
And I have to admit, this kind of arrogance is really unnerving for me. You know, acting as if you're above the law. To me, if you can't run with the big dogs, stay on the porch. If you are going to invest in this whole I'm going to be a criminal lifestyle, then you kind of need to own up to the full extent of that, including the consequences. Saadi's behavior was the textbook definition of a man who thought he could outsmart everyone, including the police, but ultimately was just a dumb criminal, thinking he had pulled off this clever crime while everyone is sitting looking at him like he's the stupidest dude in the room. His obsession with serial killers, the murders of women, and the idea of committing the, quote, perfect crime, I mean, come on, it's really not that unique. You know, we live in a society where violent fantasies are often glorified or even romanticized in movies, games, and even in the way we talk about crime. Saadi was fascinated by killers like Levi Belfield and Brianna Gay's murderer, not because they were outliers, but because they represented an extreme form of power and control that he wanted to emulate. The fact that he spent months researching not only weapons, but also how to evade capture is telling of the cultural environment that enables this kind of thinking, if you ask me.
After Nasen Saadi was arrested, he was remanded into Belmarsh jail. And while on remand, Saadi had asked a female prison guard if he was making the headlines for his crime, appearing to take immense gratification that people were talking about him. During his psychological assessment, Saadi revealed his disturbing fascination with knives and having the power in his hands, control over life and death. And it was during these assessments where it's no surprise to any of us that Saadi didn't speak with any regret, remorse, or even shame. Instead, he exhibited a disturbing pride in his behavior. His arrogance was so extreme that when talking about his alphanumeric phone password, he couldn't help but boast, convinced that authorities would never crack it. He just knew that they'd never get into it. And it was an arrogance that was rooted in psychopathy, where the lack of empathy and guilt allowed him to feel untouchable, which is a terrifying combination. But as Saadi sat in prison awaiting trial, his behavior continued to reveal disturbing layers of his psyche. His conduct during his incarceration only confirmed what we had already seen in his actions leading up to the murder: a deep detachment from reality and a disturbing need for control. Remember when we were talking about him asking the female guard what was being said about him? Well, after he asked her, being arguably the creepy loser that he is, began literally masturbating in front of her. Now, this wasn't just an act of sexual defiance, it was a statement, indicating that he had no regard for boundaries or any decency.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, Saadi is the typical perpetrator who, when we look at his case, we're left with more questions than we are answers. He comes from, it seemed, a pretty normal family and normal background. He was affluent in that they could afford for him to go to college. I don't know how the system is in the UK, but I do know that going to college is usually a privilege for most people. And so it's like, what happened? What went wrong? And why this disregard for women?
I don't know. There wasn't much background about Saadi that was published, but, I think it's icky and it's gross and it's weird, especially combined with like the sexual pleasure that he got from the murders, right? Masturbating while asking the prison guard, if his name was being splattered throughout headlines in the news. It's just gross. It's weird.
It is. As Saadi's trial approached, the prosecution was left grappling with the true nature of Saadi's motive. Obviously, he was obsessed with death and murder, but was there more? Was it about fame? Did he want his name to be remembered alongside notorious killers forever etched in history as a symbol of violence? Or was there something more insidious at play? I mean, Bailey, what do you think?
I think notoriety was a part of it, but in my opinion, I think that it was about taking power back over the people that he couldn't control, at least in his mind, which were women. I think that most women probably were spot on with their intuition that he was this weird little man, saw him as the simpish creep that he is, and I think he resented that. He wanted to dominate women and make all of these girls who friend-zoned him feel his wrath.
I mean, I feel like there are better options. There are quite a few self-help books or podcasts out there, but...
Yeah, I mean, do literally anything except be a creepy, gross dude.
Yeah, like literally anything, but instead you attack and kill. You attack 2 women and kill 1. Like, come on, man. Find a better hobby. I think what's interesting is the psychiatric report suggests that Saadi might have autism spectrum disorder. It challenges the widely held belief that he was just a psychopath. It brought up the debate on whether his understanding of right and wrong was distorted. And the judge in the trial, Mrs. Justice Cutts, did acknowledge the need for consulting with a neurodevelopment specialist to better understand the implication. In the courtroom, the chilling details of Saadi's premeditated violence came to light. The prosecution played the CCTV footage for the jury that showed the brutal attack that night on the beach, and the jurors heard the screams from the women. It showed how Saadi was stalking Amie Gray and Leanne Miles, watching from the shadows as if this were some kind of game to him. His calculated movements, his chilling calmness during the attacks, pointed to a man who relished in the thought of terrorizing others. The Winchester Crown Court heard Leanne's testimony, providing the details that proved vital in establishing the description and direction of travel of the attacker. The court heard how, despite this man's brutal murder, local residents, local business owners, and hotel workers assisted in the inquiries. Essentially, how a community united to help track down Saadi. One witness for the prosecution was photographer Michael Priddle, who had identified Saadi in a lineup, identifying him as the man who walked past him on the night of the attack near the crime scene. The prosecution also noted how Saadi's search history also included, quote, what hotels don't have CCTV in UK, and, quote, can you pay Airbnb with cash? After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for 5 hours and 36 minutes before reaching a verdict.
And finally, on Wednesday, December 18th, 2024, the air outside the Winchester Crown Court was thick with anxiety. After the jury deliberated, it was a relief to everyone attending that Nasen Saadi was found guilty of the murder of Amie Gray. He will return to court to be sentenced on Friday, March 28th of this year, 2025. But before being led away, Amie's wife, Shawn Gray, spoke the words that encapsulated both the devastation and the dignity of the moment. She said, "Amie will never be forgotten. Her life was brutally taken, but now she can rest in peace, and her strength lives on in all of us." As Shawn spoke, Benjamin May, the senior Crown prosecutor, took the podium. He emphasized that this was a senseless attack that shocked the people of Bournemouth. He detailed how the attack had been planned in the coldest, most calculating way, a fact that has haunted everyone involved in this process. But despite Saadi's meticulous plotting, no amount of premeditation could erase the reality of the pain and loss that he has caused. He planned, he stalked, and he attacked, May continued, his words sharp as a blade. Now Saadi faces a life behind bars, and we can only hope that his name fades into obscurity, a forgotten villain in a story that should have never been written. He said, "We hope that Amie's memory will live on as a much-loved young woman, a pillar of her community, who bravely and selflessly defended her friend in the face of a terrifying attack."
The courtroom buzzed with the weight of his words, and for Shawn and all who loved Amie, that promise was already fulfilled. Amie had been more than a victim. She had been a woman of strength, of heart, of conviction, a wife, a sister, a daughter, the heart of a family. But even in death, Amie's legacy continues. Vigils, fundraisers, and community efforts stand as a testament of her life. This world lost a fighter, a defender of love and kindness, and in the end, Amie's legacy will be one of light, a beacon that will never be extinguished. Though Saadi may sit in a prison cell, separated from the world, Amie's spirit will forever be free. And that is the heartbreaking case of Amie Gray, a woman whose life was cut way too short and in the most senseless of ways.
There's this really beautiful YouTube video that Chelsea and I are going to link in the show notes. And it is a video that the team that she coached put together. And it is really hard to get through it without crying. But basically, this woman, they talked about how she was like everybody's safe place. Like she was the type of person who would make you feel exactly welcomed as you are. Like you didn't have to change anything. You would just vibe with her and she would accept you through and through. And I know these stories usually end like this, but it just really pisses me off that I don't think there's a better way to describe Saadi than just a little man, right?
Yeah.
Little thinking, little respect for people, little understanding of, what matters in life. And for him to solely take somebody's life who was so great in so many ways, it just pisses me off.
Yeah, it really kind of makes me think more deeply on the fact that he was diagnosed with being somewhere on the autism spectrum. And I really wonder if we are doing enough research and doing enough for that population, because I think I've seen in my experience that there's a lot of excuses for poor or unusual behavior when there are different diagnoses in play. Rightly so for a lot of them. But again, I also wonder if we are not allowing some bad behavior because of our fear of, societal pushback, like, we don't need to reprimand or direct somebody who might have varying diagnosis, because that would be viewed as, I don't know, cruel or unkind or unjust. You know what I mean?
Right.
But are we inadvertently helping to create some of these situations in which there is lack of impulse control and you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we need to hold people accountable for their behavior regardless of any sort of diagnosis that they have, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's essentially what you're saying is, like, he might have struggled with understanding social cues, or he might have struggled with understanding X, Y, and Z, but enabling, that other more problematic behavior is causing lots of problems. And for one, you're marginalizing people on the spectrum who are perfectly capable of not murdering and attacking people on a beach.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? So I think that goes again with what you're saying, that we need to hold people and their behavior accountable. And like this dude, I think his professors were spot on, like him weirdly flexing his like toxic masculinity in class, like he wasn't this criminal mastermind or this, or this misunderstood genius. He was a weird dude that rubbed a lot of people and women the wrong way.
Yeah. I mean, in the healthcare field, we talk about universal precaution, and we treat every single patient as if they are, patient zero. Like they have every crazy disease that you could ever imagine. And that's protocol, right? That way you ensure the same care across the board for every patient, right? And sometimes I wonder if we should start essentially holding more fields to that same accountability, right? So if you are acting out of line, if you are, like you said, kind of flexing this masculinity and being very toxic or being very harmful or hurtful, towards another race or a gender or a sex, instead of just being like, well, he's just kind of a weird dude, it's like, no, that's against protocol. That's not going to be allowed. No, thank you.
Yeah.
Because I get that 9 times out of 10, it is nothing. But what if that one time it was something and we didn't do something about it?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a lot to chew on.
Yeah. And I think, like what we started off with of, trusting your intuition and trusting your gut feeling. If you notice people having red flag behaviors, don't convince yourself that it's really pink and not red, and that pink is your favorite color, right? Acknowledge that it's red, listen to your gut feeling. Just like that professor, Lisa Marie Reese, I think it's awesome. She stepped in and said, hey, this is wrong. And I think ultimately the system failed, in an overlapping
yes.
way.
I think yes, but at the same time, I think it's one of those, like, it really is a lot harder than we think it is, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot harder to pin this all down, because until you do something, is having a knife collection, is that criminal? Is looking up weird stuff criminal? Like, we look up weird stuff for our podcast research.
Sure, I'm on like the FBI's most watched list.
You know what I mean? And it is. That's a sticky thing. And it really does take a village, I think, to try to nurture, guide, but then also stop people. So shout out to all the people who, unfortunately, after that horrific attack, all like we talked about, banded together and helped bring Amie's death to justice, and helped bring Saadi to a trial that he's going to hopefully get a sentence that is appropriate for what he committed.
Yeah. So here's to all the people who pay attention and the Saadis of the world. May your Google searches always lead investigators straight to your door. That's what I got to say about that.
Ditto, friend.
Keep
ditto.
searching weird shit. This is the graph where you fuck around and find out.
Hey, is somebody going to make an app? Isn't there a developer out there who can make some app that like puts your phone on like timeout if you hit too many like insidious Google searches? It's like, I'm sorry, you are going to be in a 5-minute timeout for your first offense.
And we're going to send your information to the Department of Homeland Security.
Obviously, guys, don't come at us. We're not pro Big Brother 1984 George Orwell stuff. So, but anywho.
Well, as always, you guys, thanks for hanging out with us through this wild and crazy ride.
And as always, we'll catch you on the wild side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators.